Well, hello, interviewing friends. This is Will Bowman. Thank you for tuning into the art of the interview. I hope that each and every one of you this week is having a great interviewing experience. I hope you've gotten to talk to lots of cool people, hear lots of cool stories, and just learn lots of cool things. I know for me, one of my favorite things in the whole wide world is doing interviews with people and getting to hear their story, getting to hear them be passionate about what they're passionate about, be frustrated about what they're frustrated about, and really just kind of like sit and watch people get really excited. And one of my purposes for this series is really to help people to get better quality out of their interviews and to get to have that experience of just witnessing someone across from them just be very totally real and share their self, their deepest thoughts, feelings, wants, needs, those kinds of things. For me, that's a really valuable experience, and I hope each and every one of you have been experiencing that in your interviewing this week. If not, keep tuning into this show. Hopefully, some of the techniques will help you to get better at it. This week, I am going to be answering a question that I heard from one of my clients this week. This client is a vodcaster, and I do the editing for their vodcast. They post it to YouTube, Spotify, and they're in the process of interviewing guests. And I am kind of the technical person for this client, where I come in the behind the scenes and make sure everything gets recorded well while they do the interview. And we were having a conversation after one of their recordings, and she asked me a question that I thought would be really relevant to explore in this podcast. And that question is, how much should I talk about myself in an interview? Now, this is a complicated question. There's not a simple answer to this, because I was thinking about it and I was like, gosh, how am I going to answer this, right? You could say, yes, you should, or no, you shouldn't, but I don't think it's really that simple. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And so I sat down and I really did some brainstorming, and I came up with what I thought was, rather than a solid answer, maybe a way of engaging with the question on a case-by-case basis. Because realistically, the question, how much should I talk about myself in an interview? I don't know if it's a question that can be answered one way or another. I think it's really more of a case-by-case basis. And that's what I'm going to investigate on today's show. What cases should maybe you talk a little bit more about yourself and involve your own story, your ideas, your feelings, your products, your take on things, right? Just you, your personality, your brand, whatever that is. When should you bring yourself into the interview more? And maybe when should you leave yourself on a shelf a little bit more and talk a little bit less about you and your thoughts and focus more on the story of your client or the interviewee or whoever it is that you're interviewing. So that's what we're going to dive into today. I'd love it if you would post in the comments of this. If you're watching on YouTube, I'd love it if you would post in the comments maybe an experience that you had in an interview where you weren't quite sure to whether or not to involve your own story and bring your own story in. And then maybe that will give me some more ideas so that in the future I can bring some case studies and some ideas and engage more on a case-by-case basis. So comment below before we jump in here, but let's just go ahead and jump right in. So now keep in mind, this is really my own take on things. I'm sure that a lot of people would have different opinions of where to bring yourself in and where to leave yourself out more or less. This is really just my take based off of, one, the experiences that I've had interviewing people, and two, my own just sort of thoughts on the idea from an objective point. There are going to be some of these types of interviews that I talk about that I've never done. For, example, having like a nationally renowned podcast. I'm going to reference the Tim Ferriss show, right? I have never had a nationally renowned interview. podcast, right? I have my own dinky little podcast here where I talk to a few people, and I have maybe 30 people who listen in on a consistent basis, right? So I can't necessarily speak from experience, but I can extrapolate maybe from doing it on a smaller scale. If you talk to Tim Ferriss, he might have a completely different perspective on this. But this is really just my perspective based on my, I would say moderate experience comparatively in interviewing people. So that being said, I think that how much you should bring yourself into an interview depends really on three things. And I think you really should take it in this order, not just these three things, right? So the first thing I think you should really consider when thinking about how much to bring yourself in is the audience of your interview. Now, that seems a little weird of a place to start, but I think that it's actually a really good place to start because your audience is really who you're making the podcast for. And there's really also only two buckets that this can fall into, right? And those two are, one, they care about your story, or two, they don't care about your story. And I think that's a really great place to start your journey of figuring that out, right? So let's say that, you are thinking like, oh, well, I'm going to do this. Like maybe I think they do care about my story. So some examples of maybe where that would be, like, for example, if you have your own podcast or your own show. Now, a lot of times when you have your own show or your own podcast, people watch or listen because of not just the content that you put out, but also because of you and your personality. Right? It's not just the people you're interviewing. It's not just the subject you're talking about. They're also interested in the human side of you, right? And so in that situation, you might actually want to bring a little bit more of your story, your experience, your histories into an interview that you do on your show. A good example of this, as I said before, is the Tim Ferriss show. I really like Tim Ferriss's interviewing style. I enjoy it. He gets some really amazing, he has some really amazing conversations with people based largely, I think, on his style of interviewing people. He does bring in his own experiences. He does bring in his own sort of like thoughts and feelings, but not in a way that is, almost, destructive to the other person. He's very good about bringing it in a way that opens and brings the person who he's interviewing open as opposed to shuts them down. When you bring your story in, it can, in some situations, serve as an opening for the other person to go deeper into their story. And that's really when you're using your story well in an interview. And that works very well if you have your own podcast and show, because your audience, they do care about you. They care about your story. They listen for you in addition to what you deliver to them. Another example of when they might care about your story is when your own story is part of the narrative. Now, I know that I have seen documentary films that do this really well. I could not for the life of me think of the name of one, or maybe documentary TVs. I've seen docs that do this where the host of the story, the person going around and interviewing and collecting sound bites from people, their story is a part of the narrative that people are watching. Maybe they're investigating a subject. Maybe they're, looking for something in the world. Their story and their experience is a part of the story that's being told. And in that situation, the audience does care about their story. And so it would make more sense to bring in parts of their story to both the interviews and the narrative as a whole. Right? So in that situations, yeah, I think you should bring your story in more. Now, let's take the flip side of that and say maybe your audience doesn't really care about your story, right? So in these situations, maybe you should talk about yourself a little less in the interview, right? For example, if you're doing a news interview for television, newspaper, or online, when you watch a news interview, unless you're watching like 60 Minutes or, I'm not exactly sure, maybe some of the bigger news anchors who are more personality driven, generally speaking, your audience doesn't care about your story. You are a vehicle to whatever story or person that you're capturing. And so it makes more sense in the interview to talk about yourself a little less, right? Makes more sense to engage, to bring yourself into the interview less. Or another example, commercial interviewing for a commercial project, right? I do a lot of these as a video producer where I'm interviewing a client to capture their story. And in my experience, historically, I used to try and bring myself in more to these interviews. I would, when someone would say this, I would, launch into my own story of like, oh yeah, I understand because I was in this situation. And a lot of times it actually didn't really have the effect that I wanted it to. It actually ended up feeling like I closed the interview down as opposed to opening it up. And I think that really was because, honestly, the story wasn't about me. I was trying to use it as a way of saying, hey, you can open up. I understand. I feel you. But these days I stick a lot more to the script and focus on asking them questions. Instead of talking about me, I'll ask them deeper questions about their story. And I find that works really well in that context to get them to open up or go deeper, right? And in that situation, the audience doesn't care about my story. They're watching the video. I'm making the video for the client. It's their story that's the most important. Another example, maybe where they don't care about your story, is just general documentary interviewing. I mean, how many documentaries have we watched and how many documentary interviewers have we ever seen? Rarely, if ever, do we see the person asking the questions in the documentary that we're watching. And that's because ultimately a documentarian, their purpose is not to share their own story or to capture their own story, unless, like I said earlier, when their own story is part of the narrative. Generally speaking, it's the point is to capture other people's thoughts, ideas, feelings about what it is they're interviewing them about. So again, in that situation, maybe it would be better to keep yourself out of the interview a little more and focus more on just really being present with the story of the person you're there. So that's the first thing. Really think about the audience of your interview. Do they care about your story or do they not care about your story? The second, man, I'm just really wrestling with this. The second element to consider when thinking about whether or not how much to bring yourself into the interview is really the purpose of the interview, right? Why are you doing this interview? What is the ultimate goal of this interview that you're doing? And there are a couple different ideas that, different reasons that examples that I'll bring here. So for example, maybe you're doing a biography of the person who you're interviewing. And a perfect example of this is the recent Mr. Rogers documentary, which I think was fantastic. It was a brilliant documentary in so many ways. And the whole point of the documentary was to capture the experiences of the people who were remembering Mr. Rogers. And if the interviewer had gone in and was like, oh, talk about myself, talk about here, talk about that, it wouldn't really have felt sincere when the whole purpose was not for the interviewer to tell their story, but to capture the stories of the people who were at the end of the camera, right? So in those situations, and personally, like I said earlier, I used to bring myself more into those type of interviews. Now I tend to bring myself in less. I tend to stick to the questions and really sort of pay attention to them and really dive into their story. There are occasions when I'm interviewing for a documentary where I will bring myself in just a little bit, but it's almost always in service of going deeper with the person. Normally it's with, for example, if I'm using the acknowledgement technique, this is what I'm experiencing right now. Can you go deeper? Can you help me to understand, right? I talk about the acknowledgement technique in one of my last episodes on how to develop empathy in the context of antipathy, right? The context in which I now bring my own story in and my own experience in is only really in service of going deeper with the person who's on the other side of the camera. So that's a good example. So biographer person, maybe you're doing it less. Again, I already covered this, but I'll say it again. If this is a commercial interview, right, you're trying to get the story of a client, of a customer, of whatever, and tell their story, it doesn't work very well to just bring yourself in and start talking about yourself a lot, right? Your goal is to dive deeper with that person. Now, on the flip side, maybe the purpose of the interview is entertainment, right? some perfect examples of this are like talk shows, right? Like Jimmy Kimmel or Craig Ferguson or the world famous Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis, right? These are talk shows where you're both characters in the story of the show. And your ultimate goal is not necessarily to dive deep into this person's life. Your goal is to entertain the people who are on the other side of the camera, right? In that situation, it's actually more appropriate to bring yourself into the story because you're delivering entertainment. You're delivering, and it really doesn't matter if it comes from you or if it comes from the interviewee, right? Your goal is to entertain, and you're collaborating with your interviewee to do that. And in a lot of situations, that means bringing your story, your ideas, your thoughts, because you're part of the personality, right? So if you're trying to entertain, that makes a lot more sense. So another example of this, which I'm going to list this person, I don't love them as an interviewer, but the point where I'm going to bring this person up because I actually think that they fit into this category more than actual interviewing, and that person is the Joe Rogan podcast. If you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, what you'll very quickly notice is that at least half of the time in the interview, sometimes, at least in my experience of listening, it's Joe talking about his ideas, his thoughts, his feelings about subjects, as opposed to really diving into the person who he's interviewing. I have listened to 3 Joe Rogan podcasts. I listened to 1. I had this experience. I listened to 2 because I wanted to give it another example, had the same experience. And then the 3rd time I listened to it, and it was the exact same experience. Almost every time I listen to Joe Rogan podcast, I leave feeling very unhappy because I don't know very much about the person who he's interviewing. I know more about Joe than I know about the person who he's talking to. And what I realized was because his podcast is not about the person. His podcast is about entertaining and engaging his audience, which happens to be a very niche group of people, right? His purpose is really to focus on certain subjects, certain topics that he thinks are interesting, he thinks are valuable, and really to entertain. That's why a lot of times he does do a little bit, he gets people riled up, right? Because this is his purpose. It's really to entertain people, to get people to engage. It's not really, and at least that I'm thinking of, at least that I've seen in the interviews that I've listened to dive super deep into the life and experience of the person he's interviewing, right? And if you're entertaining, you should bring your story in more, right? It makes more sense. And going back to what we talked about earlier on the Joe Rogan show, his audience does care about his thoughts and his feelings because they're like him. They want to know more about him, right? They're less interested in the stories of the people there. They're more interested in Joe and his thoughts and feelings. So that being said, I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But the point is entertainment, yes. Bring yourself in a little bit more. It makes more sense because it's less about getting down to the depths of the person who you're seeing across and more about creating an experience for the people who are watching you. Another example is selling a product. So a lot of businesses and service providers these days are stepping into the world of podcasting because they're interested in selling their product, right? It's kind of the idea of content marketing. You produce a piece of content, for example, a podcast or a video podcast, and then you deliver that content to people for free, building your own authority, right? In this situation, it does make sense to share a little bit more of your own experience, to share a little bit more of your own ideas and your own feelings and your own thoughts on things, because ultimately the purpose of this podcast is to build your own authority. And you can't do that if your audience doesn't know who you are and what you're doing. Now, I think you can go too far with this. And I especially if you're doing interviews, whenever you bring someone on to do an interview with you, I think you at least have some obligation to make it at least partially about them, not just about your own agenda. And so I think you can take this too far if you're talking too much about yourself. But if your ultimate purpose of the podcast is not just to dive into the person's story, but also to position yourself as an authority, it does make sense to bring yourself, to some degree, into the dialogue, your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own feelings, your own stories, because you're really wanting to connect yourself to the people who are listening as well as the interviewees that you're talking to, right? How much that is might depend a little bit more on the subject matter, on, your own personality, and you're going to have to feel that out. But ultimately, if your ultimate goal is to sell a product or to connect with people who are listening with you to yourself, then you should be sharing to some degree your own stories, your own thoughts. All right, so that's the second one. You got the audience of your interview, the purpose of your interview, and the third one is the type of interview, right? So once you've thought about the audience, once you've thought about the purpose, now you're thinking about what am I doing? What's the pragmatics of how this interview is going to work? That's also going to determine how much you bring yourself into the interview. So, for example, behind the scenes interviews, right? These are interviews that you're never going to be visible to the people who are watching. So, for example, commercial interviews, documentary interviews, whatever that might be, you're sitting down, you're behind the camera. By definition, you're not in front of it. And in that situation, you should probably talk about yourself a little less, right? Like I said, I've done a lot of these interviews and I used to bring myself in more. And now I do it less because in my experience, it doesn't work as well to bring the audience or to bring the interviewee it doesn't work as well to get the best story out of them, because ultimately the whole purpose of that is to get the story out of them, not out of you, right? So in my experience, behind the scenes, behind the camera interviews, you should bring yourself in less to those interviews. Talk shows are another type of interview, and this one, I think it really depends, and that's why I list these last, is because the type of interview I think actually affects it less than the other things that we've already talked about. But a talk show, you're going to have more impulse to bring yourself into it than a behind the scenes, behind the camera interview, because you're a partner, you're on the show, you're engaging. A lot of this will depend on the type of show that you're doing, what you're doing. I hosted a small town talk show called Coffee with Will for a while, and there were a lot of times where I did bring myself in, my own thoughts, my own feelings, and that really served to make the person comfortable, to make them relax, to make them, get them into hey, we're just having a conversation. We're both here and it's okay to just have a conversation, right? It made sense in that venue to bring myself in a little more. Other talk shows, maybe not so much. I don't know how many times in interviews that Jimmy Kimmel or Craig Ferguson or whatever are really telling their own stories from their own families and those kinds of things. A lot of times maybe they'll do something separate from their guests, but when their guests come out, they are asking them questions, joking, those kinds of things. So it really depends on the talk show, right? Another example of a type of interview where it depends is the vodcast, right? There are a lot of podcasts out there, and it really depends on what type of podcast, what the subject is, what format it is. Is it long form? Is it short form? What are the nuances of what you're trying to cover? All of this really depends of how much you should bring yourself into this story. And you really need to think through those things, right? And then finally, the one that I was going to say, which I think it makes sense to bring yourself in more, is a subject-based interview. So for example, let's say that you are a interviewer. For example, let's say that I am bringing in a guest to the art of the interview, and I'm interviewing them about that. We are both people who are very passionate about this subject of interviewing, of talking to people. Right? It actually would make more sense for me to come in and to bring in my own sort of examples, my own story, my own history, because that's going to create a better experience for the people who are watching, right? Because there's two people who are interested in this subject talking about it, and then there's a third person who's interested listening to it. So that would make sense to me to have a little bit more of your own story. My father-in-law really likes to watch this podcast, which I think I'm going to throw it out there. I'm pretty sure this is the name of it. It's called Meat Eaters. And it's hosted by sort of a guy who's got a survivalist, some hunting history, and he really sits down with his guest and then 2 or 3 other people, which I think are on his team, and he definitely does bring himself into the interview, right? Because he's a little bit of a subject matter expert on some of the things that they're talking about, or at least he tries to be. He reads books, and so in that situation, it kind of makes sense for him and his team to bring in a little bit more of their story, because they're interviewing, subject matter experts from a place of a little bit of authority, right? So in that situation, makes sense to bring it in a little bit more. So I realize that's it. Those are the 3 things. First, the audience of the interview. Second, the purpose of the interview. And third, the type of interview. I realize that I may not have brought a lot of clarity to this subject but I hope that maybe this gives you a little bit of a framework when you're thinking, maybe if oh man, I have a podcast, or if I'm a news interviewer, how much should I bring my own story into the interview? I think that's really what we all have to do as interviewers. This isn't an easy question to answer for us. It really depends on all those 3 things. And then also at the final moment, it really depends on the particular instance, right? There are times when I will bring myself in more to an interview because I feel like the interviewee warrants it. There's some times where I'll just sit back and get out of the way and let them do their thing and really focus on them. And that's something that we as interviewers have to learn how to feel out. It's not something that will just be apparent to us like a math equation. So much of what we do is based on instinct. It's based on nuance. It's based on emotion. It's based on us really being present with the person who we're interviewing. And at the end of the day, we have to learn the skills and the intuitions to be able to make those decisions in the moment that we're in, and engage with the person in the way that's best for them being able to tell their story. And also for us to be able to accomplish the purpose of the interview, whatever that might be. All right, that is today's episode of The Art of the Interview. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this video, please hit that little like button on the bottom on YouTube and feel free to share it along. And we will see you next week for another episode of The Art of the Interview.